Many of us find it's not easy to think clearly about today's public policy issues. It's even more difficult to think about them in a thoroughly Christian, biblical manner.
You go in and to the polling booth and I will leave some empty because I don't know anything about either of them. All these different precincts are just like, okay, I don't even recognize those names, we're just gonna leave them empty, you know? And then like, that's ridiculous. I don't even know the names of the people I'm supposed to be voting for.
I hardly even listen to it anymore because I feel like everybody is saying the same thing. Everybody's just trying to appeal to the public and get votes, and it doesn't seem to me that there are many politicians, if any, out there that are truly interested in the betterment of the country, and it is frustrating.
I tend to get more frustrated by public policy debates when the people seem to talk past each other.
We all live such busy lives today, and we're all busy with the kids and the family and school and work, so it's not always easy to stay informed on all of the issues.
Have you ever felt the way these people feel? I know I have. I suspect most of you have felt this way at one time or the other, or maybe most of the time. As a result, social scientists report that most of us, instead of thinking through public policy questions for ourselves, simply adopt positions on issues and candidates based on our family backgrounds, our occupations, the income group we are in, and the communities in which we live.
I think we should do better than that. I mean, sometimes it may seem rational, but I think we should do better than that.
Well, the basic thing is that we do live in a fallen world, and the book of Romans is very clear about this, that we're surrounded, we're immersed in fallenness. And there's a real danger that we'll simply go along with. We'll conform our thinking to the patterns of a fallen world. And this is certainly true with questions of public policy. And we're also today, of course, surrounded by so many ideologies. I mean, you have the right wing and the left wing, and people, who want to distinguish themselves from each of those wings. And it's so easy for us to sort of pick one of the ideologies and subscribe to it.
We all sense there must be a better way. Paul in Romans lays out the starting point for that better way. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But what does this mean when it comes to the political world and public policy issues and controversies? I find that sometimes a concrete example can help us to see what is needed. We can go back 200 years to Britain for one such shining example.
In 1785, the slave trade was the mainstay of the British economy. Cruelty seemed to know no limits, as men and women were dragged from their African homes, packed onto ships, transported to the West Indies, and sold for huge profits. Many died in the process. 1785 was also the year God called William Wilberforce, the 26-year-old member of Parliament, to full commitment to him. Wilberforce spent the rest of his life in Parliament, working year in and year out to end the slave trade and to enact a host of other reforms that changed England forever.
Wilberforce's conversion played every role in his life in politics. I don't think there's anyone who can honestly study the period of history and study Wilberforce's life and come to any conclusion except that his faith brought him to take on the slave trade. Anybody who was not of a serious Christian faith couldn't believe that the slave trade was wrong. They'd lived with it for so long. It only was the serious Christians, in those days they scorned them as Methodists and enthusiasts. It's only the very serious Christians, as Wilberforce had become, who believed the slave trade was actually wrong. And so there's just no way to see it except that it was his conversion that led him to take on slavery and the slave trade. That's indisputable. It was just a brutal battle such that he had to be encouraged by God. God called him to it. He got a letter from John Wesley saying that you're going to need to know that this is going to be a place where you have to rely on God. You can't do this on your own. And I'm sure that he wouldn't have been able to see it through if he hadn't been relying on God completely. One of the joys for me of the life of Wilberforce is to see that he was one of those Christians who was thoroughly in the world and thoroughly not of the world. He was somebody that he didn't just have this compartmentalized Christian life. He wanted to be familiar with all of the great works of politics and literature and history so that he could be a better Christian in the real world, so that he could translate his faith into these areas. So it wouldn't just be about theology. It wouldn't just be about talking to people about salvation. It would be about everything. He wanted to know how his faith, how taking the Bible seriously translates into every sphere. And it really was something that was almost unique in his time.
William Wilberforce was truly not conformed to the pattern of his 18th century world because he was transformed by the renewing of his mind. We, I am convinced, are called to do no less in our day. It is only as we do so that we can be used by God to influence our communities and nation for the good. Now, I don't want to pretend this is an easy task. Like anything else in our walk with Christ, it requires careful thought, prayer, and, most importantly, a willingness to be guided by the Bible and its truths.
I really like something John Stott, the great British evangelical, once said to a group of us back in the early days of sort of evangelical social action stuff. He said, we all need to be conservative radicals. We need to be conservative about one thing and one thing alone, and that is the absolute truth and authority of God's Word. Everything else in the light of God's Word we need to subject to critical scrutiny. And that means we have to work hard as Christians to stand back and to say, are the voices that I'm hearing around me saying things that fit with what God says in the Scriptures? And that's an ongoing task.
This video series and my book on which it is based are designed to help us to be transformed in our minds so that we will not be simply good citizens, but good Christian citizens. In doing this, we will be guided by certain truths God has given us in His Word. The next 4 segments introduce 4 key biblical principles that will help us to evaluate today's public policy questions, and then the next 7 segments illustrate how these 4 principles can be applied to 7 key public policy areas.
In the following chapters of this video series, we will consider the meaning of justice.
I just want to repeat that. This is not about charity, it's about justice.
We will consider the appropriateness of the questions our leaders sometimes ask us.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
We will consider biblical principles that lead to neither liberal nor conservative conclusions.
Well, if you're a liberal, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity. If you're a conservative, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity.
We will consider the place of the family and other civil society institutions in God's will for our society.
He leaned across the table, pointed his finger right in my face, and he said, when those children cross the schoolhouse door, they're mine. The parents have nothing to say about it. I control everything.
We will consider our responsibilities as stewards of God's creation.
And we're kind of squeezing a lot of God's other creatures out. We're taking away their provision that God gave to them. That's not stewardship. As one of my colleagues says, extinction isn't stewardship.
And we will consider our responsibilities as Christians while our nation fights a war on terror.
We cannot be carried away by anger, by a spirit of vengeance, by winning at any cost. And we have a special obligation to tell the world that terrorism isn't the biggest threat. What's the biggest threat is that we be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ.